There's much going on this time of year and throughout the world, but one thing has come to my attention, to all our attention. The election of Donald Trump as our next president has ignited a rash of speculation about the future of U.S. policy toward Cuba. What we know is that the president-elect has said contradictory things about President Obama's decision to resume diplomatic relations with Cuba, as he has about some other issues. He has tweeted that he plans to reverse the Obama administration's regulatory changes, relaxing restrictions on U.S. engagement in Cuba, unless the Cuban government agrees to a, quote, better deal. But despite that, we don't actually know what he will do. I hope before making a decision, he listens to advocates on both sides of the issue, including Cuban Americans, a growing majority of whom support the resumption of diplomatic relations. As someone who's traveled to Cuba many times and seen firsthand the benefits of the policy of engagement for both the Cuban people and the American people, I'll do whatever I can to encourage the president-elect to continue that policy. The decision to resume diplomatic relations has been enthusiastically supported here and around the world. One of our strongest allies in South America, their ambassador talked with Marcel and myself the day our flag went up for the first time in over 50 years at our embassy in Havana. And he said, you know, our country has always strongly supported the United States, but we're also strong friends of Cuba. And your relationship between the United States and Cuba was always like a stone in our shoe. Today, when your flag went up over our embassy, the stone came out of our shoe. We see the number of Americans who travel to Cuba risen dramatically. U.S. airline companies and cruise ships are carrying passengers there. Hotel deals have been signed. But the same 5 members of Congress, 3 in the Senate, 2 in the House, out of the 535 members of the House and Senate, these 5 members have steadfastly opposed a new opening with Cuba. They continually say that the only Cubans who have benefited from the new openings are Raul Castro and the Cuban military. Well, of course, the Cuban government has benefited. That's unavoidable. It happens in any country with state-owned enterprises, with which we also have diplomatic and commercial relations. There are many like that. But it is false and misleading to say that they alone have benefited. In fact, the Cuban people, particularly Cuban entrepreneurs, have benefited, so have the American people. And they overwhelmingly want this opening to continue. Now, I've met many times with Cuban government officials. I've also met with Cuban dissidents who've been persecuted and imprisoned. No one is a stronger defender of democracy and human rights there than I am. I raised the issue of dissidents being locked up, first with face-to-face with Fidel Castro years ago and many times since with Raul Castro. Like President Obama, we all want the Cuban people to be able to express themselves freely and to choose their own leaders in a free and fair election. But I resent the assertions of those who remain wedded to the old failed policy that to favor diplomatic relations is appeasement to the Castro government. We know how well that failed policy has worked for well over 50 years. It's accomplished almost nothing. I'm as outraged as anyone when Cubans who peacefully advocate for human rights and democracy are harassed or threatened, arrested, abused, just as I am when such violations of human rights occur in other countries, including countries by governments whose armed forces and police annually receive hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. aid. Now, for 55 years, we've tried the approach of isolating and pressuring Cuba. It's advocated by a dwindling, albeit passionate, minority in Congress. That approach has failed miserably. The Castro family and their shrinking circle of aging revolutionaries still in power. Cuba is still a country where political dissent is not tolerated. And no one who knows the Castro government expected the resumption of diplomatic relations to quickly result in an end to repression of free elections. Those who label the policy of engagement a failure after just 2 years because the Castro government continues to persecute its opponents are either naive or not to be taken seriously. Change in Cuba will happen incrementally, as it does in most countries. But I have no doubt that in a lot fewer than 55 years, the Cuban people have a lot more freedoms than they've had the past 55 years. The record is indisputable. Bullying the Cuban government, making threats and ultimatums, have achieved nothing in more than half a century. In fact, it isolated the United States and damaged our own interests. Consider for a moment what it would mean if we did what these 5 members of Congress advocate. Not only would we have no embassy in Cuba, but if we followed that rule and if we were consistent, we'd have to withdraw our ambassadors and impose a unilateral embargo against China, Vietnam, Russia, Ethiopia, and many other countries where human rights are routinely violated, where political opponents and journalists and human rights defenders are imprisoned and tortured, where there's no such thing as a fair trial, where civil society organizations are threatened and harassed, and where dissent is severely punished. And when we withdraw from all those countries, I could give you a long, long list, if we follow the same criteria as we have in Cuba, a list of many, many countries that we have to withdraw. If we withdraw, others are going to happily fill the vacuum, as they have in Cuba, which trades with countries around the world, including many of our closest allies. In fact, I recall a meeting I had in Havana with the ambassadors of at least a dozen European and Asian countries and the representatives of many businesses from those countries. They told me, you know, we love your embargo. We keep your embargo. Our companies want you to keep your embargo because that means they can be here and they don't have to compete with American businesses. They're going to do business with Cuba. They're delighted we don't want to or didn't want to at that time, so they wouldn't face the tough competition of American companies. Is that what these isolationist members of Congress want? Or are they just concerned about human rights in Cuba? Would they rather have Cubans buy rice grown in China or in Louisiana? Would they rather have Cubans buy milk from New Zealand, as they do now, or from the United States? Would they prefer that China and Russia build the ports and airports in Cuba while we lower the flag at our embassy, pound our chest, and demand the Cuban government relinquish power? Well, that argument is illogical, as it is inconsistent. For 55 years, Americans have been free to travel anywhere. Iran, Russia, Vietnam, any country in the world that would allow us, but not to Cuba, which is only 90 miles away. Just think of that as one, one of my fellow senators, a Republican senator who's traveled often to Cuba, said, there's one thing if a communist country tells me I cannot come to their country, but I don't want my country telling me I can't go somewhere. Last year, more than 500,000 Americans visited Cuba. And this year, the number is even higher. Even for my little state of Vermont, so many people just drive a few miles to the airport in Canada and fly down. But these members of Congress want to turn back the clock and make it a crime for Americans to travel to only one country in the world, Cuba. If North Korea will let you go in, you can go there, but not Cuba. If Egypt cracking down on dissent, you go there, that's fine, but not Cuba. And I could go on and on and on. Fortunately, far more Republicans and Democrats in both the House and Senate support the right of Americans to travel freely to Cuba, the right of U.S. farmers to sell their products on credit to Cuban buyers, which is still barred by the embargo, and the ability of Cuban private businesses who are already benefiting directly from the new opening with the United States are going to benefit even more when the U.S. embargo, a failed, self-defeating, vindictive policy, if there ever was one, is finally ended. I've talked to a lot of these businesses. They are now able in Cuba to make money they never were before. Because as things open up, they can start having what is basically private enterprise. You know, those who continue to defend the embargo should listen to these people. I hope the president-elect will listen to them. The purpose of a policy of engagement is to protect and defend the interests of the United States and the American people, and to promote our values and our products. Diplomatic relations is not a reward to a foreign government. It's what we do to protect our own interests. Do the isolationists think that our embassy in Russia is a reward to President Putin? Or that having an ambassador in Moscow somehow conveys we agree with President Putin's corrupt and repressive policies? Does anyone think that Russia's embassy here in Washington is somehow a reward to the United States or to President Obama? Does anyone think that the Cuban government regards its ambassador here as a reward to us? The United States has interest in every country, even if it's just to stand up for the rights of Americans who travel and study or work overseas. But there are many other reasons, like promoting trade and investment, protecting national security, law enforcement cooperation, or stopping the spread of contagious diseases. These are all things that are in the best interest of the United States, but far easier to do if we have diplomatic relations and full involvement with the other countries. We either believe in the benefits of diplomacy or we don't. We either empower our diplomats or we don't. Cuba, after a year of difficult negotiations, agreed to reopen embassies. Americans are traveling to Cuba in record numbers, including representatives of American companies, chambers of commerce, and state and local government officials. Madam President, our two governments have signed new agreements, paving the way for cooperation on a wide range of issues, from the resumption of regular postal and commercial airline service to cooperation on law enforcement and search and rescue. And I would urge members of Congress to get briefed on the cooperation we've had even before this resumption with Cuba on issues of law enforcement and search and rescue. It might be an eye-opener. Obviously, the issues of search and rescue, of law enforcement, can be to their benefit, but it's to our benefit. How I wish that other countries in that part of the world did as much to stop the flow of narcotics in the United States as Cuba does. Now, I understand that this is an emotional issue for some Cuban-American families, including some who are members of Congress. I've met with a number of these families. But I've also met with many who have come down to Cuba, even though their property had been taken by the Cuban government, even though they thought they would never go back, but now they can go and see old friends, and the change in their views. In fact, after 55 years, survey after survey, poll after poll, shows that most Cuban Americans support the new policy of engagement. They want the United States to have an embassy in Nevada. They're not saying that they agree with or want the kind of things they saw by the government or its late leader, but they want the U.S. to have an embassy in Nevada. There's a time for family politics, and there's a time for what is in the best interest of the nation as a whole, all 50 states. Diplomatic relations serve the national interests. I urge these members of Congress to put what is in the interest of the American people above their personal interests. Listen to the overwhelming majority of the Cuban American people who want the policy of engagement to continue because they believe it is the best hope for free and prosperous Cuba. I think of what we can do with person to person, what we can do with student exchanges, what we can do with having our medical community work with the Cuban medical community in some of their research on cancer and ours. And I think of just small things. Marcel and I had a delightful time here a few months ago when we went and cheered on in Vermont a group of Little Leaguers from all over our state. They were going to Cuba to play with Little Leaguers in Cuba. Marcel and I gave them an American flag that had been flown over the United States Capitol. These kids were grinning from ear to ear holding it. And then they sent me pictures of them flying the American flag in the various venues where they were playing ball. And standing, being photographed with the Cuban teams with their flag and our team with ours. Now, just like a few years ago, the idea of the U.S. flag flying in those venues and being cheered by the people there. One of the photographs that I remember the most from that trip, taken by a member of my office, Lisa Briganti, from behind. One team wore red T-shirts, one blue. Here's two kids, and they're so much like you see with Little Leaguers. They're walking off the field, their arms around each other's shoulder. They just play this game together. You don't have to see their faces. You don't have to see which T-shirt says U.S., which one says Cuba. You know it's one of each. But they've come together in their love of the game. Think of the students that can be going down there, whether it's on Fulbright scholarships or anything else, and the students who come here, as they already do. Madam President, I think of the times during the worst part of the Cold War. And I'd go to countries behind what we then called the Iron Curtain. And I'd be talking to foreign ministers or defense ministers or people in key positions, and they'd say, you know, my niece went to Stanford, or my son is studying at Harvard. and some would tell me in my own alma mater of Georgetown. These are openings, and openings that everybody from our diplomatic corps to our intelligence community would tell us is very important, because people would actually know who we are. And just as importantly, we might know who they are. So I urge President-elect Trump to carefully weigh the pros and cons of this issue. I believe that if he follows his instincts, if he listens to Cuban private entrepreneurs, he too will conclude that it makes no sense to return to a failed policy of isolation that has been used by the Castros as an excuse to justify their grip on power and their failed economic policies. They invited the Cuban American people that no other country in this hemisphere supports. Is as that ambassador said to Marcel and myself, when your flag went up, the stone came out of our shoe. In some ways, those who wanted to keep the repressive form of government, the best thing going for them was our embargo. I told Fidel Castro that at a private meeting a number of years ago with him, accompanied by another senator from this chamber. And I said, why do you complain about our embargo? It's the best thing you have going for you. You have a failed economic system, you have a failed political system, and you can blame it all on the United States. What we should be thinking instead is that the Cuban and the American people share much in common. Our history, our cultures, our families, our ideals, our hopes for the future. We are neighbors. Our economies are increasingly intertwined. We should no longer be isolated from one another. I think what a difference it is when I was a young law student. Here at Georgetown, Marcel and I living in a basement apartment, listening to every single bit of the news during the Cuban Missile Crisis, wondering if we were sitting in what's going to be the center of a nuclear war. What a difference since then. I did not think that I'd be a United States Senator then. I just wanted to pass my bar exam, go back home to Vermont, which I did, to practice law. Vermont was home, is home, and continues to be home. But what I hear from Vermonters every day is about time. It's about time we change that policy. So as the Castro era nears its end, our policy today is focused on the next generation of Cubans, entrepreneurs, and activists, students, and leaders. They are Cuba's future. We should endeavor to engage with them in every way we can. I met with some of them, as did a bipartisan group of House and Senate members earlier this week. Bright young people were starting their own businesses. And what a refreshing attitude they had toward life. Will it change overnight, Madam President? No. But it has changed considerably from what it was for over 50 years. I like to think that my children and my grandchildren see a different world than what this young law student saw back then. So, Madam President, I'm going to yield the floor, but before I do, I just say I will speak on this many, many more times. I think it is important, not just our relationships with Cuba, but for the whole hemisphere. The stone has come out of their shoe. Let's not put it back in. Let's work to help the Cuban people, not the Cuban government, but the Cuban people. But when we do help the Cuban people, we help ourselves. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.